It began not as a sound, but as a rumour, a whisper that travelled from the docks of Liverpool to the air bases of East Anglia. They were coming. Not the Germans, who everyone was trained to spot, but someone else. Someone new. By the winter of 1943, Great Britain was exhausted. It was a nation defined by what it had lost. 4 years of total war had bled the island grey. The daily reality was the queue, the line for bread, for potatoes, for a single egg. It was the blackout curtain, the hiss of the wireless, the taste of powdered milk and the constant dull ache of rationing. This was a country holding its breath, surviving on stubbornness and tea. And then the Americans came. They didn't arrive. They erupted. 1.5 million of them pouring onto the island in preparation for D-Day. They called it the friendly invasion. But for the 50 million British civilians who had to make room, who had to share their scarce food, their narrow roads and their quiet pubs, it felt like something else. An occupation by allies, an invasion of noise, of colour, of staggering, baffling confidence. The first shock was not the uniforms, it was the abundance. The GIs seemed to come from a different planet, a land of impossible wealth. They were clean-shaven. Their uniforms were perfectly pressed, their pockets bulging. They had things the British had only seen in Hollywood films or long-lost memories. Chewing gum, real coffee, mountains of cigarettes and chocolate bars. They were loud, they were optimistic, and they had money. The average American GI earned 5 times the pay of his British counterpart. A private in the US Army was paid more than a captain in the British Army. This was not just a military alliance, it was a collision of worlds. In her diary, a young woman from Norwich named Phyllis Davies tried to describe the moment they arrived. We just stood and watched. They were so big. Not just tall, but healthy looking in a way we aren't anymore. They were laughing, throwing sweets to the children who were scrambling in the gutter. It was like watching a film. We were grateful, of course, but it felt strange, as if we were the poor relations and they were the rich family come to visit. The children were the first to surrender. They learned the new language of survival, a phrase that echoed in every town square, every railway station. Got any gum, chum? The GIs were generous. They were good-natured, but their generosity was a weapon. It highlighted in the starkest possible terms the poverty and exhaustion of their hosts. The British were supposed to be the senior partners in this war. They had fought alone in 1940. They had endured the Blitz. Now, suddenly, they felt like extras in their own story. The stage was being taken over by these loud, rich Hollywood heroes. Gratitude is a heavy burden, and it didn't take long for that gratitude to curdle into something more complex, something sharper. The British were polite, of course. They were famous for it. But in the quiet of their homes, in their letters, and in the bitter jokes whispered in pubs, they were already searching for words to describe this feeling. This friendly invasion had begun. This new reality, this collision of worlds needed a name. It needed a definition. And it was born not in a government office, but in the factories, the pubs, and the queues. It was a single, bitter, perfect phrase that captured the entire spectrum of British feeling, from wry amusement to genuine resentment. The only trouble with the Yanks. They are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Overpaid was not a perception. It was a mathematical fact. The Americans hadn't just brought their army, they had brought their economy. They swarmed the pubs, drinking the beer dry long before the locals could get a pint. They didn't just buy souvenirs, they bought out entire shops. They waved wads of cash that seemed to the British fantastically, almost offensively large. This new economy created a new kind of social warfare. A British Tommy, home on leave after years in the North African desert, found he couldn't compete. He couldn't afford to take his own wife to the cinema, he couldn't buy his girlfriend a drink. The writer George Orwell, observing the cultural clash in London with his famously sharp eye, wrote about it in 1943. He noted the sheer physical difference. The Americans were healthy, well-fed, their uniforms impeccably cut. He saw them as plump, vigorous men who had not known hunger. He wrote, "The general consensus is that the only good Yank is a dead Yank. The British soldier is poorly paid. The American soldier, meantime, swarms across the country, his pockets full of money. He is everywhere, demanding, noisy, and ignorant of the local customs." It was this noise, this confidence that grated on the British nerves, which had been stretched to the breaking point by the Blitz. The Americans didn't understand the sanctity of the queue. They didn't understand the quiet, unspoken rules of a society under siege. They treated the blackout not as a matter of life and death, but as an inconvenience, striking cigarette lighters in the darkened streets, drawing the furious curses of air raid wardens. But overpaid was a grievance. Oversexed was a panic. This was the part of the phrase spoken with real venom. The GIs were young, they were far from home, and they had been fed a Hollywood-inspired image of Britain, a land of quaint villages and perhaps accommodating women. They brought nylons, perfume, and an easygoing charm that was intoxicating to British women worn down by years of austerity. Dance halls in towns like Leicester, Bristol, and Ipswich became battlegrounds. Local men, both soldiers and civilians, would stand on one side of the room, watching in grim silence as the local women flocked to the Americans. The GIs had the jitterbug, they had the charm, and they had the nylons. A British soldier wrote an anonymous bitter letter to the New Statesman magazine, which was read and passed around in barracks across the country. We, who have fought for 4 years, are we to return to find our homes, our jobs, and our women taken by these men who have bought their way in? They are not soldiers, they are conquerors, but they conquer with chocolate. This wasn't just jealousy. It was a genuine fear that the very fabric of British society was being unravelled by these glamorous, well-paid allies. The statistics were staggering. By 1945, over 1 million illegitimate children had been born in Britain, a massive increase. A significant portion of these were Yank babies. But the real crucible moment, the event that tested Britain's moral compass more than any other, had nothing to do with jealousy or money. It was the moment the British people realised their allies had brought a war within a war. The American army that arrived in Britain was a segregated army. It brought its colour bar with it. Of the 1.5 million Americans who came, over 130,000 were black soldiers. They were assigned to separate units, usually logistical or engineering corps. They slept in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and drank in separate designated pubs. The US military command, led by General Eisenhower, was adamant. American racial policy would be maintained on British soil. The British government, anxious not to offend its powerful, indispensable ally, quietly agreed. The War Office issued memos advising British soldiers to be tactful and to avoid making difficulties over the American custom. But the British people did not agree. They were, as a nation, completely baffled. Having been told for 4 years that they were fighting a war against Adolf Hitler's racist ideology, they were now being asked to enforce segregation in their own villages. To the average Briton, who had almost never seen a black person before 1943, this American policy seemed not just strange, but hypocritical. It was the very thing they were fighting against. In villages across East Anglia and the West Country, where these all-black units were stationed, the locals simply ignored the American rules. They saw the black GIs not as a problem, but as men far from home, just like any other soldier. And crucially, they saw them as polite, quiet, and grateful, a stark contrast to the often loud and boastful white GIs. A mass observation report, a government project to record public opinion, noted the widespread confusion and disgust. The average Briton finds it hard to understand the distinction the Americans make. As one man put it, "I can't see what difference the man's colour makes. They're both in the same uniform, aren't they? Fighting the same enemy." This public refusal to cooperate created immediate violent friction. The US military police, the Snowdrops, tried to enforce segregation. They would enter pubs and demand that the British landlords stop serving their black comrades. And the British landlords, almost universally, told them to get lost. In one famous incident in Norfolk, a publican named Ralph, who had served black GIs all evening, was confronted by white American MPs. They demanded he eject the black soldiers. Ralph refused. The MPs threatened to put his pub out of bounds. He replied, "This is my house. I say who drinks in my house, and I will not have any man, whatever his colour, told he cannot drink here. You can leave." This wasn't an isolated incident. It was happening everywhere. The British public had chosen a side in this war within a war, and they had chosen the black GIs. The white American soldiers, seeing their own rules flouted, grew furious. They saw the British as naive, as undermining their authority. The tension finally snapped. The friendly invasion was about to turn into a civil war, fought on the cobblestone streets of a sleepy English town. The place was Bamber Bridge, a small cotton mill town in Lancashire. It was home to the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, an all-black segregated US Army unit. And like everywhere else, the local pubs, the Old Adam's Head, the Hob Inn, had welcomed them. The black GIs were popular. They were polite, shared stories, and were seen simply as allies. On the night of June 24th, 1943, that welcome was put to the test. 2 American military policemen, both white, entered the Old Adam's Head. They saw black GIs drinking with the British locals. This was a violation of their rules. They tried to arrest one of the soldiers, Private Eugene Nunn, for an improper uniform, a common pretext. The landlord, a Mr. T.A. Worswick, refused to let them. He told the MPs that in his pub black soldiers were allowed to drink. He stood between the MPs and the soldiers. Then, the British civilian stepped in. A local mill worker standing at the bar reportedly turned to the MP and said, "Why do you want to arrest him? He's doing no harm. He's in here with his mates." The entire pub turned hostile, not towards the black soldiers, but towards the white MPs. One of the MPs, enraged, hit the British civilian. A local soldier from the British Army's Royal Artillery grabbed a beer bottle and smashed it over the MP's head. The pub exploded. It wasn't a brawl, it was an uprising. The British civilians and the black GIs, fighting as one, physically threw the 2 MPs out of the pub and into the street. The MPs fled, promising to return with reinforcements. The black GIs, knowing what was coming, ran back to their base at Adams Hall. The Battle of Bamber Bridge had begun. The American High Command had feared a race riot on British soil, and now they had one. But it was one they had started, and their opponents were their own black soldiers and their British allies. A few hours later, the white MPs returned, armed, in a jeep mounted with a machine gun. They drove to the barracks, expecting to round up the mutineers. They were met with a hail of stones, bottles, and eventually gunfire. The black soldiers, fearing for their lives, had broken into the base armory. For 4 hours, the streets of Bamber Bridge became a war zone. Shots were exchanged. One black GI, Private William Crossland, was killed. Several others were wounded. The next morning, the town was in shock. The British civilians were horrified, not by the black soldiers, but by the ferocity of the American military police. A local woman, interviewed years later, recalled the feeling. "We didn't see what the fuss was about. They were our Yanks, the coloured ones. They were ever so nice. It was the white ones, the police, who caused all the trouble. They came in here trying to tell us our business. Well, we wouldn't have it." The Battle of Bamber Bridge was a secret war, hushed up by both governments, but the message was clear. The British people had been tested, and in the choice between their government's diplomacy and their own sense of decency, they had chosen decency. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was an extreme case, but the friction was real, and it was everywhere. While the GIs were segregated by race, the British began to segregate them by a different metric: experience. They started to see 2 different American armies. There were the black GIs, who, as one sociologist at the time noted, were seen as more modest, more or less English in their quietness. And then there were the white GIs, seen as brash, boastful, and overbearing. This wasn't always fair, it wasn't always true, but it was the perception, and it was fueled by the most explosive part of the oversexed complaint: the sheer number of romances, affairs, and inevitably pregnancies. The American GI, with his Hollywood smile, his smart uniform, and his endless supply of nylons, chocolate, and cigarettes, was a figure of fantasy. To a generation of young British women who had grown up in the grey austerity of the Depression and the war, the Americans represented escape. They were a ticket to a Technicolor world. The statistics tell the story. In 1943, British women were marrying Americans at a rate of 150 per week. By the end of the war, over 70,000 British women would become GI brides, packing their lives into suitcases to follow their new husbands to a country most of them had never seen. But for every marriage, there were countless other, less formal arrangements. The American Red Cross set up GI bride schools to teach British women how to be good American wives, instructing them on everything from American etiquette to how to use a modern refrigerator. The British press, meanwhile, was filled with anxiety. Moralists fumed about the decline of British decency. Newspapers ran worried articles about jitterbugging, the wild American dance that was seen as dangerously immoral. They called the women who dated GIs good-time girls, or more cruelly, Yank slags. A magistrate in Exeter, dealing with a case of a 16-year-old girl who had run away with an American soldier, spoke for many of the older generation. It is not merely that our young women are being led astray, it is that the entire social fabric of this nation is being threatened by a foreign culture of loose morals and easy money. These men are not allies, they are a moral contagion. This anxiety reached a fever pitch with the illegitimacy crisis. The number of babies born out of wedlock soared. The British government, in a panic, had to pass emergency legislation. They created affiliation orders, special legal decrees that allowed British mothers to claim child support from the American soldiers who had fathered their children. It was a cold, bureaucratic solution to a deeply human problem. Thousands of Yank babies, or half-American children, grew up never knowing their fathers. They were the living, breathing evidence of the invasion, of the cultural collision that had swept through their towns, their homes and their families, leaving nothing quite the same. But this friendly invasion, with all its noise, its friction and its moral complexities, was not a social experiment. It was a military necessity. It had a deadline. By the spring of 1944, the mood across Britain shifted. The GIs, who had been a fixture of daily life for nearly 2 years, suddenly vanished from the pubs and dance halls. They were confined to barracks. The roads were choked with endless convoys of tanks, trucks and artillery, all grinding their way south toward the coast. The great secret, the invasion of Europe, was about to be revealed. For the British civilians who lived near these new, sealed-off sausage camps, the tension was absolute. They knew what this meant. The men they had argued with, danced with, drank with, and resented were about to go and fight. The sheer scale of it was unimaginable. In the days before D-Day, one woman in Devon, Molly Skinner, wrote in her diary about watching the convoys pass her house. She hadn't been a particular fan of the Americans. She found them loud. But now, she wrote, "They have been passing for 3 days, not in groups, but in a solid, endless line. Tanks and lorries and guns, thousands of them, and the men. They are not laughing now. They are quiet, sitting on the tanks smoking. Some of them wave. I find I cannot sleep. God help them. God help them all. The cultural clash, the resentment over pay, the jealousy over women, all of it evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a profound, shared sense of gravity. These invaders were now unequivocally allies. They were about to risk everything for a shared cause." Then, on June 6, 1944, the BBC broadcast the news. The landings had begun. Across Britain, there was a collective national gasp of relief, of fear and of awe. The invasion was over. The liberation had begun. For thousands of British women, the news was personal. The GI bride phenomenon was no longer a social trend. It was a source of crippling anxiety. Women who had married Americans, mothers of Yank babies, now waited for the postman, dreading the telegram from the US War Department. The complaints about the GIs being over here vanished overnight. They were replaced by a new, desperate fear. A woman in Bristol who had a daughter engaged to an American paratrooper wrote to her sister, "It's a terrible thing to say, but I miss the noise. I miss them laughing in the street. The town is silent and it is a dreadful, heavy silence. We all just wait. We listen to the wireless and we wait." The British civilians had watched the Americans arrive as a loud, rich, conquering force. Now they were watching them, from a distance, as a generation of young men marching into a storm. The relationship had been forged in friction, but it was about to be sealed in blood. The war ended, not with a single day of peace, but with a slow, grinding release. And as the sound of war faded, the sound of the Americans leaving began. The departure was as sudden as the arrival. The GIs, who had become a permanent, noisy fixture of British life, were suddenly gone. They were redeployed, or simply going home. And for the British civilians, this created a new, unexpected and profound shock: the silence. The pubs were quiet again, the dance halls were empty, the narrow village streets were no longer choked with jeeps. For many, the feeling was not just relief, it was a strange, hollow sense of loss. They had spent 2 years complaining about their loud, rich, overbearing houseguests, and now they missed them. A woman from a small town in Suffolk who had been a vocal complainer about the GIs wrote to her brother in late 1945, "It's the most extraordinary thing. The Yanks have left, and the town feels dead. It's as if the colour has drained away again. We have our village back, but I find myself missing the noise. Isn't that a mad thing to say? They left behind more than just memories and empty chewing gum wrappers. They left 100,000 Yank babies, many of whom would never meet their fathers, and they took 70,000 British women. This was the final act of the invasion, the GI Bride exodus. From 1945 to 1947, ships like the Queen Mary were refitted as bride ships, transporting tens of thousands of young British women, many with babies in their arms, across the Atlantic. They were leaving a grey, bankrupt, exhausted Britain for the promised land of America they had only heard about in films and from their new husbands. The photographs from the docks at Southampton are a heartbreaking final chapter. They show these young women, full of fear and hope, waving goodbye to the families they would likely never see again. They were the last, most permanent human consequence of the cultural collision. So what did British civilians say when 1.5 million GIs invaded their towns? They said everything, all at once. They said they are overpaid, oversexed, and over here, a phrase of brilliant, bitter, perfect resentment. They said, "This is my house," as they stood up to American MPs, defending a black soldier's right to have a drink in a Lancashire pub. They said yes, marrying 70,000 of them, choosing to leave their homes, their families, and their entire world for a future in a foreign land. And they said God help them as they watched those same loud, annoying boys drive quietly to the coast to face the machine guns on the beaches of Normandy. They said they were grateful. They said they were angry. They said they were jealous. And they said they were inspired. The friendly invasion was never a simple story of alliance. It was a chaotic, complex, and deeply human relationship. It was a culture clash that forged a bond, a resentment that mastered deep reliance, and an invasion that, in the end, helped secure the liberation of a continent. The GIs came as strangers, were treated as invaders, and left as family. The British people, in all their complexity, wouldn't have had it any other way.